Well, hello everyone. We are going to discuss now competitive environments and competitive strategies. You may be surprised why each time that you start a strategic management seminar, competition is the first topic that almost everyone starts. And the reason is because competition is responsible for the profits of an organization, any organization, business organization or non-profit or government. And profits is like the blood of the organization. If you don't have profits, if you don't have money, the company cannot survive. So profits are normally the first thing that you have to ensure that it works. And this is something that when we discuss about how organizations create economic value, remember that we show that profits depend on competition, on competitiveness. So you see here how the EVA is strongly connected to the competitiveness or level of market power. So the first thing we're going to do is to analyze the competitive environment. So now we are going to talk about environment, the competitive environment. And the reason is because the competitive environment is the first driver of the level of competitiveness and the level of profits. So it's something that many times companies can have any control on the environment, but many times they can't. So many times they have to live with the external environment. So remember that we already talked about this. So you have 4 types of competitive environments. Perfect competition, that means that the company sells a commodity or a standard product. Consequently, margins tend to zero and EPA tends to be negative. Monopolistic competition, perfect competition, remember that we discussed, is typically commodities like sugar, coal, these kind of products that are standard. Monopolistic competition, remember we discussed, that is when there is some possibility to differentiate, like McDonald's is not the same as Burger King. So normally most of the products that have a brand, they tend to have some ability to differentiate, and normally their EVA is around 0 or maybe a little bit higher than 0, or maybe can change. 1 year is -1, the next year is +2, etc., etc. But it's roughly around 0. Why? Because their capacity to differentiate is weak. So organizations can differentiate, but not tremendously. Then oligopolies, that is when organizations don't really compete, like Coke and Pepsi. So they compete in many minor things, but not in prices. Consequently, their EVA can be very good. In the case of Coke and Pepsi, their EVA is around 10, 15, 20%, depending on the years, but it's pretty high. And finally, monopolies, that is when there's no competition at all. So, or very light competition. For example, Microsoft Office or Microsoft Windows has a market share well above 90%, like 95, 96, depending on the years. But consequently, their EVA can be extremely high. And there are other factors, but these are the most important. So now we are analyzing these 4 competitive environments. We are analyzing the environments, not the strategy. So the first thing you have to realize is that there are different theories, and we are relying on different theories. And this is important for you to keep in mind. Porter is excellent to analyze situations of competition. So Porter is very good. He was a champion. He wrote his books 30 years ago, during the 80s. So in those years, remember, Porter is an economist, and he wrote his book about imperfect competition. So imperfect competition is a typical an economic discussion, that the 2 cases of imperfect competition is perfect competition and an imperfect competition, that is monopolistic competition. Finally, the second theory was game theory. Game theory is a theory that is relatively newer, is theory of the 80s, 90s especially, that once again is a very economic and mathematical model that basically explains when organizations interact to each other, and one impacts on the other, what the other reacts, then impacts on the first one reacts, and so on. So, and all using econometric models or economics models. And finally, monopoly. And game theory and the resource-based view of the firm, that are the ones that you use for oligopolies and monopolies, are also mathematical, but especially economic models. So you see, everything is economics. And it's interesting because in the old days, like 30, 40 years ago, most of the strategic management was driven mostly by people coming from marketing or management or human resources or operations, whatever. But you see practically economics has taken over in industrial strategic management. And it's good because all the econometric models that they use produce a lot of rationality and critical thinking. And so you see why we use so much these economic models that I'm not telling you the model because it's going to be too dry for you, but I'm using the consequences of the model in this all critical thinking that we are discussing every week. Okay, so the first type of competition is, as we saw at the left, perfect competition and monopolistic competition. And as I mentioned you, Porter is a champion. Okay, you can read the Porter 5 forces one by one. I'm going to explain only a couple so you can get what is the rationale. When you have a large number of competitors, you have many competitors, like 50, 100, whatever. The higher the number of competitors, the lower the market power. So the more intense the competition. Consequently, if the competition is very, very, very intense, the level of margins are going to be very low, tending to zero. The existence of fixed costs. Fixed costs is something that force companies to be very aggressive. If you look at your profit and loss and you see that you have a lot of fixed expenses, necessarily you have to compete very aggressively because you have to ensure that you have enough revenues to afford and pay for these fixed expenses. So some industries have a high level of investments, like industries very high tech, or industries with a strong brand or that require a lot of money in advertising or promotion. So everything that is fixed expense normally forces the organization to be very aggressive and increase the level of competitiveness and reduce the market power. Consequently, the profits go down. Differentiation. Some organizations cannot differentiate. If you sell sugar, there's nothing you can do. Sugar is sugar. People go to the supermarket and buy the sugar based on price. Nobody. And well, you have different types of sugar, but in each segment, so white sugar, so there is no ability to differentiate. And we can expand this a lot. In the paper that I gave you, Critical Thinking, this is more explained. So you see that based on this, you can define whether an organization is in perfect competition or monopolistic competition. All these factors talk about competition. You see that all talk about competition. Can be more or less intense, but both compete. Okay, the next in our graph is the case of oligopolies. Remember that is in our chart when you move a little to the right, and it's based on game theory. Let me try to explain a little bit about game theory. Game theory is basically when one company makes a strategic move and the competition reacts, and based on a series of factors, that is what game theory explains or analyzes, you can define whether it is possible to collude, in other words, to avoid the competition in prices or not. For example, market maturity. What happens when a couple of organizations have been in the world competing for many years? Well, they have learned that it's not a great idea to compete. That it's better to collude, as Coke and Pepsi, that they don't really compete. So the fact that they have been for many years helps organizations to collude. It's like, Grandpa. Grandpa is an old guy that, he drives his car very slowly, very prudently, because he already had a lot of wrecks and he doesn't want to have another wreck. So he's going to drive slowly because he doesn't want to have another problem. So aging or years or maturity or whatever leads organizations to be more prudent and avoid competition, collude, and consequently raise the level of market power. Market atomization reduces market power. What does it mean? Well, if you're in a business in which there are many small competitors, so the level of market power kind of goes down. In other words, if you have 2 or 3 competitors, normally these 3 competitors, it is very bad for them to try to compete, because most likely the competitor is strong enough and it's going to react. Consequently, it's going to whatever you do, if the competition reacts, it's bad for you. Like many years ago, all the famous cola wars, and it happened the same in cigarettes and in different industries, in what one of the competitors decided to reduce the prices and the competition reacted immediately on the same day. But if there is a atomized and you have small competitors, if a small competitor has a 2-3% market share, it can be very aggressive, and the big guys don't care. So the small competitor can launch very low prices, and the large competitors don't even realize. So the small competitors can eat one competitor and another and increase from 1% market share to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and the big guys don't realize. So and that is what makes competition very, very intense. So having small guys, the small guys can be very aggressive, and the large big guys don't react. So this is the thinking of game theory. So all this interaction. Okay, you can analyze the remaining factors. The next is the case of full monopolies, like they give you example of Microsoft Windows, Microsoft Office, the concept of resources, unique resources. So when you have a resource that competition cannot imitate, that makes you very, very strong, very monopolistic. For example, experience, technology, like Intel, the ability to innovate, like Apple. Okay, this makes these companies very, very, very aggressive. Strong customer relations. I mean, if you have your account with Bank of America for 30 years, you feel lazy to go to another competitor, so to another bank, because it takes you months until you put all the automatic debit again, blah blah blah. So normally the relationship with one, in some cases is not, some cases irrelevant. So to move from Subway to another brand like a Firehouse or whatever is irrelevant, because you just go from one to another. But in some cases can take you months or a lot of time. Consequently, a good relationship with a supplier is something that produces a monopoly, a natural monopoly. Okay, and you can analyze the rest of the factors. But you see that a relationship is a resource. Experience, technology are resources. The ability to innovate are resources. You see, economies of scales, like the breweries, they are resources. If you have economies of scales, you can be very, very powerful. I always put the example of Kirin, the brewery in Japan. They have a market share of 80-something%. All the rest of the competitors, they have a market share of nothing. So they can eliminate competitors if they wanted. They don't want to do it for legal reasons, but they could. Because once you are so big, I mean, to deliver one beer or to deliver 1 billion beers, you need to have exactly the same warehouses, the same trucks, the same branding, the same product development, the same administration. You see, so small companies that need to have all this gigantic administration or warehouses, so only for one beer, they cannot survive. So you see that the economies of scale is another resource. So you see the concept of resources is very, very wide. Okay, now that you understand all these factors, and they are very important to detect whether you are competing in perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, monopoly, then you come to the strategies. And I already gave you some hints. First hint is that the strategies must be connected with the environment and with the results, and this is very important. Sometimes we tend to forget, and we tend to believe. Many years ago, I had a group of students that came to the front of the class, and they said, we are going we have produced coffee in one island in the Caribbean, and we are going to do a lot of this and this and this. I said, listen, coffee is a commodity, so you cannot do a lot of this or a lot of this or a lot of this. You can't. So if it is a commodity, you are in perfect competition, and the only strategies that you can work on are related to price, to low cost. That's all you can do. So the competitive environment and the strategies are strongly connected, and the results too. So this guy said, no, my EVA is going to be 5%. It's not going to be 5%. So if you work in a commodity, unless you can collude and create a cartel, like oil, for example, petroleum, is a commodity, but they can create a cartel because there are a few countries that produce oil, and they created this OPEC cartel, but it's unusual. So there are not too many cartels out there. So most of the cases of commodities, they operate in perfect competition. So you see that there is this consistency that I wrote here between the environment, strategy, and results. And you need to become you learn to work on this consistency in this class. This is a central part of critical thinking. I already mentioned you in the other video, so I'm not going to repeat one by one, that how perfect competition leads to different type of low-cost strategies. Monopolistic competition leads to some sort of the 4 Ps or the 7 Ps of the marketing mix: product, pricing, etc., etc. So because you have, in this case, you can differentiate. Talking about product strategy is a possibility. Here is impossible, but here is you can do it. Finally, your oligopoly, in most of the cases, is like Coke and Pepsi try to avoid competing in prices. You compete in many other things. Coke and Pepsi compete in tons of things, but not in prices. And finally, monopolies, as all the examples that I gave you, Intel or Microsoft or whatever, that they are very monopolistic, doesn't mean that they don't have to be 100% monopolistic. It's enough that they are the incumbent, that they can manage the market. So they have all strategies based on creating unique resources, and this is what makes them unique. That's it.